want to welcome all of our guests today to today's webinar, APIs, the easiest access to your data. My name is Terry Bruner and I'll be your host for today. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping issues. First of all, we are recording this and we will make it available both on our website and on our YouTube channel after the webinar. Secondly, we do this as a little bit differently. We don't have a lot of slides. So if you don't see any in the middle of this, that's okay. This is a panel discussion, so just a handful of slides. And also, we do like questions along the way, so make sure that you put those in the Q&A pane or the chat pane. And then once we're done with the panel discussion, we'll actually let you ask live questions along the way. I want to introduce you to our panelists that we have today. First of all, Corey White, who's the founder and CEO of Cyvatar. I've got Faisal Lakhani, the CEO of API Sec AI, and Rob Black, the founder and managing principal at Fractional CISO. Corey, I'm going to kick this off to you.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Terry. I'm not going to waste time with my introduction. Faisal, you want to jump in? Can I give you a little bit of background? And you and I have worked together for a very long time in different capacities. I think it was going back to, was it 2007 when McAfee acquired your company?
That's exactly right. Yeah. So yeah, Corey. Yeah, we've been working together for quite some time. Really focused around initially the transition to DLP and how do you get DLP to become a normal course of business. And it's funny because back then when we talked about DLP, it was about, oh my God, can we really read our employees' emails? Is that really something we should do? And now today, the world of security has just made a lot of that sort of stuff commonplace. So, thanks for having us. I'm the CEO here at AppySec. I'm a serial entrepreneur, kind of building businesses and growing them in the security analytics market, and been doing this for quite some time, probably longer than I want to admit. So that's me.
Thanks. And Rob, I mean, it's so good to have, a CISO, virtual CISO, perspective on things, because I think a lot of us end up spending time on these webinars and you end up just talking tech. And I know we just talked about that, but glad to have your perspective.
Well, great to be here, Corey. We don't go quite as far back as Faisal, but really appreciate being included. So we work with a number of different companies, helping them with their cybersecurity leadership. And I think one of the consistent things we see really for all of our clients, whether or not they're in the tech sector, is their application security, their vendors' application security, and the APIs that, of course, are key parts of that. And it is interesting that there's a lot of focus on kind of what you see OWASP top 10 type API issues, but there isn't necessarily a lot of focus on probably the majority of the code, which is the APIs and stuff under the APIs, and really all the exploits that can happen there. So really glad to be part of this panel.
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting. So, I love the way we all kind of tie in. Faisal was making products for a very long time. In 2007, it was my teams, helping to get, DLP implemented back in the McAfee days. And at the end of the day, as I've, continued to evolve, I've realized that, we need to make these things relevant, to companies. And, if you don't get outcomes and tie them together to where CISOs can understand it, and then Rob and I talking about partnerships at certain levels to where we can help his customers get outcomes, and same thing with Faisal's customers getting outcomes, and it ties into at the end of the day, what is an API? And nobody's talking about it. People talk about application security and web apps and securing that, which is to me is the old school legacy, but nobody's talking about APIs. Faisal, why is that?
Well, I think it's the classical problem of nobody thinks about security until it's important, right? So if you look and say, what's been happening in APIs? For the last 10 years, people have been embracing, enabling. I mean, when you look 10 years ago, we didn't have companies like Apogee and MuleSoft and these innovators in the API world. It took them a number of years to get it foundational. And so now, we're starting to see people go, wait a minute, now I have this, it's out there, people can access it, shaking my head moment, going, what do I do to secure it? And you know, Corey, it's kind of like DLP, right? When I think about this and said, what happened in DLP? There were a number of very public breaches, and these breaches suddenly caused a lens to fall on this to say, oh, what do we do, right? And the world of security is kind of ass backwards, you know, and I understand why, because nobody buys security. It's not like, oh my God, I want the best security. It's a problem of how, you know, you need some driver, and that's what we see, and that's the fundamental struggle is people don't even know they have a problem with their APIs today because they're not warned that there could be something with serious implications.
You know, it's funny that you were telling me that the other day, and I was thinking about it, and how I frame it up is it's the new zero-day vulnerability. Yeah, if to your point, 80% of the internet is driven by APIs, and that's from Alchemy. Like, wow. So if nobody's securing them the way they should be secured, it's you know, if I were a hacker, malicious hacker, I'd like, oh wow, I'm just going to attack the API. Nobody knows about it. Nobody's caring about it. Nobody's securing it, and that's a huge problem. So Rob, as a CISO, how are CISOs not looking at this? I know you understand it, but what about everybody else?
So I have a background in application development and application security. So I certainly have looked at it. I think a lot of CISOs are, more on the networking side. So I think, probably there's a little bit of a blind spot there. I do think it helps, for folks that are listening, to just think framework-wise, like, why is this different? And, so I kind of have a mental, why are APIs different than application security? So APIs are still vulnerable to, let's say, traditional applications attack, like an OWASP top 10 thing. You can do injections, or you can have, all those kind of standard thing, cross-site scripting, anything like that can still happen on the application side or on the API side. But on the API side, you really have three things that are somewhat unique. And those are really around identity, scale, and unintended consequences. So, for identity, it's so obvious. So let's say you're a practitioner and you're connecting one system to another system. What are you going to do? You're going to take a static key and plug it in both places. Now, that static key is not changing. It's not changing next year. It's not changing the year after. There's no change your password 90 days. All the people that worked on that left the organization, and that key is still there. Now, maybe they're good guys or maybe they're bad guys. But the point is that as that key ages, there's risk in using a static key to integrate things. Same thing with identity is user permissions are well understood. Everything makes sense from a user perspective. But what are the right permissions for APIs? Well, they have to do everything, so let's just give them admin level privileges. Now, all of a sudden, you have this thing from an identity standpoint that's really not in good shape. You haven't locked down the privileges and you haven't locked down the identity. And I don't know if I'll dive into the other two later to give, just kind of just open the discussion. But, the same is true for scale and kind of just unintended consequences. In both of those cases, people aren't thinking about APIs in a different way than they are about the rest of application security, and really to many companies' detriment.
Yeah,
and that's just crazy because anybody who has a background in cybersecurity, having a static lockdown down, not changing key. It's just a bad idea just across the board. But does the way we do APIs have to change and evolve, or do we just need to work with a product like yours at APISec? Faisal, what needs to happen?
Yeah, so it's interesting because you got to dissect what the heck is an API. What is it? Right? And an API is nothing more than a lens into the application. And you're like, let's pause. Let's think about that. So application it's banking, it's Bank of America, and the API gives access to a consumer to what they should do. Okay, so two things what Rob said. There's identity, who are you? And then the business rules, the business logic that's in the application that says, what can you do? Now, when we think about those, and by the way, before I go further, that is unique application. It's not like, Corey, the old world of security where we're like, okay, you know what? we're going to put a firewall. And oh my God, the firewall is awesome because it does layer 7. And oh my God, it's awesome. Each API is unique.
Yeah.
It's designed with its own permissions. Back to Rob's point, how do you make sure that a user sees what they should see? That's easy. How do you make sure a user can't do what they shouldn't be able to do, right? And so now all of a sudden your mind's blowing up because this is not, do I have the right containers? Do I have the right open source software? Do I have the right key? It's not that. It's, is the application allowing the right users to do exactly what they're supposed to and nothing more? That's different, Corey, right? And so it's a problem that people are just like, whoa, how do I solve
think
that?
about this. Anyway, we've all been in cybersecurity a long time, and that takes me back 20 plus years. Whereas I think even back to the Foundstone days, where you're thinking evil but you're doing good. And so people, when they were designing these APIs, they weren't thinking evil. They're like, oh, everybody's good and everybody has full access. You do whatever you need to do, but they aren't thinking about the hacker mindset of someone going in and doing whatever the hell they want to do within that, and ultimately something malicious. I mean, how are we still stuck in that? I feel like we aren't progressing sometimes in cybersecurity. We're still just old school.
Yeah.
I think it depends on the organization. So Netflix a few years ago, so this is actually to my second point on scale, Netflix a few years ago intentionally DDoSed themselves, and not by kind of traditional DDoS methods, but basically by calling their APIs, knowing that there was a cascading set of APIs below them, to kind of prove that they were susceptible to certain types of attacks. Now, everyone doesn't have the resources of Netflix, so they're not going to be able to do that. But there are some companies that are being proactive about that. And I would suspect that many companies, and if you think about it, an API, you make a call to an API, and it's it spawns 10, 100 threads, 1,000 threads, I don't know. Now, what happens if you keep on calling that API and basically use up all the resources on the system, right? So there's a certain kind of class of attacks where that's totally the case. Now, if you're Netflix, you research that, you test against it, you try to make things happen. But I would say most companies, we work with a bunch of tech companies, that's not something really usually on their security plan, because guess what? It's a small percentage of attacks. It's unlikely to happen, but of course, unlikely to happen doesn't mean it won't happen. It just means it's unlikely to happen until it does.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's the conundrum in cybersecurity. It's funny you say that. You talked about test cases. I have a customer. We were looking, and one of the goals of CyberStar, as it looks at application security, is to be able to go into a customer, look at what applications they have, and figure out, okay, we need to secure all of your applications. If that means we're bringing in multiple products and bringing our services on top of it and building executive dashboards, but it is remediated. We're getting them to a clean state. But to do that, we got to be able to identify what those risks are and vulnerabilities are. And first we had a traditional tool or a more traditional tool, and it wasn't seeing anything. And then we started digging a little bit deeper, and then Faisal, you and I, we talked. And I was like, well, okay, let's look at the APIs and look at it from that angle. And we found a ton of stuff, and nothing else was actually seeing. And so it's crazy. And then what we're thinking we may have to do is, let's go and do a bunch of test cases. That is manual, and I in 2020, moving forward in my life, I don't want to do anything manual. Sorry, I'm a lazy security guy, so I'm not gonna go and manually write a bunch of test cases and dig into that application. And most DevOps people, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, they're not gonna do that either. So you're just stuck. And so with APISec, we're able to see some of those test cases and see some of the risks, and then start working through remediating. But that is just a lot. You have to have someone with that background and knowledge to be able to approach it that way, to be able to solve this API issue. It seems crazy, but I guess you guys singing the same thing. I guess I'm asking that.
Yeah, so maybe I'll start. I mean, I think the problem is we as a security industry have a fundamental issue. We come at things and say, oh my God, we got to protect the baby. Let's put something around the baby. Let's put a firewall. Let's put all sorts of things. And so you go, okay, let's go back 20 years and say, the fundamental issue was the way the software systems were designed left vulnerabilities, right?
Right.
So you're like, okay, well, now that's motherhood and apple pie, isn't it, Faisal? Because now you're saying go back and write better software, like that's going to happen? Because really companies want to deliver software, deliver value, and the velocity is something that people don't want to back up on. So then you sit there and you say, okay, so I don't want to slow down, but I need to uncover what's wrong. So how are they doing it? They're doing what you're saying. Oh man, I'm going to write test cases. Well, are you really? I agree with you, Corey. You're not, because you're going to test the success path. Take Venmo. When Venmo's breach occurred, what did they do? If you analyze the breach, which we can do separately, they actually tested success paths. They didn't stop and say, well, how could somebody nefariously do that? And why? Because we as a security industry sit here and say, oh, we've got to get our people to be smart security coders. We got to get our developers and slow them down, slow our developers down so that we make them secure better, right? And that's the wrong model. The right model is to say, go fast and uncover the vulnerabilities very, very quickly. As fast as you're going, go build the APIs, go build the software, uncover the business logic role vulnerabilities, and fix them. That's the right answer. Build good software, not put layers of security on top and say, oh my God, my layers are going to protect me, because they will not. That's my view. I don't know, Rob, what do you think? Am I being crazy?
Well, I think that's a great example, the Venmo one. The business logic. So basically, I put that in the unintended consequences bucket. And, in one respect, the Venmo attack was basically functions as designed, as kind of like you pointed out. Like, no, you're supposed to be able to query and find out what financial transactions people did. But, you're only supposed to get a few of them, not hundreds of thousands of them. And then,
Wait, I gotta jump in. I have a Venmo account, but it freaks me out. Like when I log in, I see friends and people paying other people. I don't get it. Like I don't care if they paid somebody for dog sitting or whatever. It just I don't get the concept of it. And to me, it just the leakage of information. If I pay somebody, like I don't want other people to know that.
Okay, so by the way, I don't know if you can see my phone, but on your Venmo, set your privacy settings to private instead of public. Can you guys see that? Set it to private and not public. Yeah, it's Venmo it's a real tricky one. It's like, okay, these three people are splitting a pizza, awesome, but when you share that data, think about the data that's in there. It's like, okay, who are my friends? Who, maybe we're not splitting a pizza, but we're buying illegal drugs, which they actually found, people found to do it, and they list it as the reason, right? So that, there are all sorts of things that could be there's for blackmail, for figuring out your network, potentially phishing information. So now, they know that, that I go, we went to this restaurant or we did this thing and I paid this certain amount, right? And you could craft a phishing email that said, hey Rob, and something very specific to that. So, that kind of data can be actually pretty concerning, but in aggregate, you can learn a lot of things about, specific people or just about, their networks. And, obviously bad guys can use that to their gain if they're trying to leverage someone or do something bad. So I would say on an individual level, put private on your Venmo, but at a macro level, protect your APIs because, for your business, it's maybe not financial transactions that are public, but, probably something else could be very valuable. I mean, if you think about Facebook, the kind of data that they exposed, there's just a tremendous amount of data in those APIs. If you're intending to make things public, you really need to think through what's possible. And I think the the business. I like the business logic view of the world that Faisal framed, because I do think that's that's a good way to think it. Maybe that's what you intended as the developer, but maybe you should step back and think, is that really what we want, or do we want people to do this at scale? Because when you can do things at scale, you can cause a lot of damage.
So let me throw something out there. Is the reason for this problem, and I'm not plugged into the developer community, so I don't have to worry about too much hate mail. but is it the developer's fault? I mean, they're not thinking about cybersecurity. They're just trying to move fast. And do developers need to own some aspect of cybersecurity? Like, if, is that the problem? I mean, should we just blame the developers?
Um, you know, I do so. I think it's tough to blame the developers. I mean, oftentimes they're being asked to do certain functional things. They're given a tight time frame. I think blaming the organization is probably more appropriate because, did their leadership or security management say, hey guys, we got to leave time to test for this stuff. We got to leave time to design it properly. We got to do security reviews. We got to do code reviews because, a lot of those things probably aren't happening in the cases where companies are having all these problems. And then, how do you do that at scale? As Faisal points, if you're just focused on happy path testing, yeah, things are going to go great. And then, but how about the 70% of cases you haven't tested?
Well, see, the problem with that, Raj, is that I talked to a ton of, small to medium mid-market startups, just last year. And I asked them about cybersecurity, and then they want to engage us at the point where either some large companies come to them and said, hey, you need to be secure. What are you doing around security? And then it's like nothing. And some of these companies are 3-4 years in. Then, or if they have a breach, then they're like, okay, I guess we should do something around it, or compliance. Other than that, they're just developing their new, super cool app tool, product, and they don't care about security at all. They're not going to spend money on security at all.
Well, I think this is why I have this up here because the reason people make a buying decision is to enable sales or to reduce their risk, right? I mean, so it's compliance risk or security risk or to enable sales. Now, if you're a startup, money's tight, you're probably focused on the functional aspects of your solution. Obviously, you could have a kind of company killing moment if you make some of these mistakes. But I agree with you. I do think societal education, like webinars like this, are great, where we can raise the awareness of some of the challenges here. But I think money is a big incentive, so it's tough to fight that one.
So Rob, I'm gonna take a different view, right? I think the problem is, like, if we go to developers and say, hey, do secure code review. Hey, go make sure we do a security assessment. What did you do? You slowed them down. And I think the weakness today is that when we think about security, we're like, okay, let me design it well, right? Let me do all of these steps. And you go, okay, you can do that, but you're going to slow down. And today, given our profit motive, every company's like faster, quicker, faster, faster. I think the problem that we have today as an industry is that we don't have enough solutions that sit there and say, I'm going to keep up at your speed. You keep going, right? Yeah. You continue to develop at high velocity and don't even think about API security. Don't even do it. Well, there'll be technologies that bring that. Sorry, Rob.
So I don't know, Faisal. I love philosophically, totally on board. I think from a practical standpoint, unfortunately, maybe it's our job to slow things down a teeny bit. And listen, if there's a tool that allows for developers to be successful without the slowdown, I'm all for it. In my experience, though, sometimes that slowdown does allow for better, for better outcomes. And it's not just the stuff we're talking about, right? Sometimes there are things outside of that where the unintended consequences may not be even tied to the code, right? And so you do a code review and you're like, wait a minute, what about X? And something that's not related comes up. Or people say, oh my gosh, why do we even have this piece of data in here? Maybe let's just delete it, right? I mean, there can be things when there's human interaction that can create value. I agree with you though. I mean, I'm all for, especially, in a DevOps model, if you can build in these tools to the DevOps cycle where basically developer commits the code and like all this magic happens, and then that's awesome because, they wake up the next day, they get a notification, oops, you got to fix this thing, or this isn't quite right. And, really no time was burned. It's still fresh in their head and they can fix it easily.
Yeah. The problem with security is we're used to noise. We're noisy people. We're like, oh, look at these 100 vulnerabilities. And and developers sit there. I've been there going, what do I do with these 100 things, right? And that's why, I think we are one of those. AppSec is that vendor. When it comes to APIs, that's our narrow aperture, is if you can tie it to say, hey, I can tell you, hey, Corey, this API allows Rob to touch Faisal's transactions and Faisal to be able to do very unusual things, and it's too wide open. Now, all of a sudden, you've got security gas that you're laying on top of development process, which Rob will still take time. Sorry, Corey, go Corey.
Yeah, no, we're on the same page. It's funny. I think it's relevant. I think about Black Hats next week, and I've been going for the last 20 years or so, and it's and I'm sure people will throw something virtually at me, throw fruit at me, but the hacker mentality and being at Foundstone back in the day and finding vulnerabilities, and one of my current customers, as I was building up this business, we were talking about assessments and pen testing and everything else, and she said, yeah, we need to do it every year, but Corey, I hadn't fixed the shit you sent me last year. And I'm like, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. And I was in the state of rethinking everything. So I'm like, why do I do that again? And then I thought, well, it's compliance, it's best practice, but it's not. What we've done in cybersecurity is that we've said that point in time is a best practice. And that's ingrained in our blood at this point, that you do your code review or application test or pen test or whatever, and you've done your security for the year or quarter or whatever. But the way things are developed, I mean, there are changes every single day in some companies in the applications and APIs. So doing a yearly pen test or application test makes no sense. So it blows my mind that even compliance regulations say, well, have you done your yearly pen test? It doesn't even apply. So changing the business model to where we're continually assessing and remediating in a subscription is what actually makes sense. And using a tool like yours at API Sec, and we have a few others, but we focus on everything we do is continuous, and that's the way we should be doing it. But now my mind is blown. Why don't we do that anywhere else? What's wrong with our thinking? Did we just got to restart cybersecurity and redo it because we thought about it the wrong way from the beginning?
Yeah, I think the problem is we way back when, I'm old, we had this moat and wall model, right? And we were like, oh my God. And then the cloud came in and virtualization, and it blew apart the runtime execution environment. Right? And then we turned around and said, okay, we can't control the runtime execution, so a firewall at a perimeter no longer does it. A DLP at a perimeter doesn't do it. So then we said, well, okay, we got to think about it differently. And all we did was propagate the same crap. We said, oh, now we have a firewall at the cloud. Oh, I have one in Azure. Oh, I have one in GCP. Oh, I have another one in AWS. Oh man, I got to manage all of them. And we just perpetrate the same framework. And the issue is we start by saying our software has vulnerabilities, and the only way to protect it is build better software by writing it right to begin with, or put security around it, both of which I think are flawed, right? Putting security is flawed. If you could do it, you should build security in. And that doesn't mean slow down development, which is what usually that means. That I completely agree. We're propagating the past, right? That's our problem.
Yeah. So Corey, I think continuous scanning is super valuable. So in the case where we have clients that do that, I mean, we find things right away. We can resolve them right away. It's really nice. I would say less good is doing it monthly, less good than that's quarterly, less good than that's annually. I am an advocate though for an external, validation, external pen test, just because, even if you're doing continuous evaluation, it is good to get a second set of eyes of someone who's not in your environment. And you say, oh, well, that doesn't really count. But, agree philosophically that continuous makes a huge difference. I think doing it in the build process, so it's specifically tied to, application development also makes a huge difference. and I really do like the concept of not slowing things down, although I am going to push all my clients to do code reviews and to slow things down maybe a little bit. But hopefully we can minimize that, and especially with the automation tools. I mean, that is a really good way to do it.
But Rob, let me be difficult, right? I'm going to be difficult for a minute, right?
Okay.
I'm usually difficult, but
Yep.
Corey's laughing. But
the goal of this is we challenge each other. Then,
it's good.
So I look at a pen test and say, okay, so what do you do when you do a pen test? Take an API. Let me give an example. Yeah. An API has 100. Let's make it small API. Let's call it 100 endpoints. Right?
Yep.
Small. What does a pen test do? A pen tester sits there and they try to use Burp Suite or some other technology platform to go do. How much of the API do they truly cover?
Yeah. So coverage is 100% a challenge. So I didn't say exclusively do a pen test. I say, do it kind of as a, on top of automation testing. So automation testing, you're going to have your coverage much higher up. Kind of depends, but at least code coverage wise, you're going to be much higher up. A successful pen test basically means the pen tester did not find anything. It does not mean that there's nothing there. But however, if a pen tester does find something, right? I mean, potentially where there's smoke, there's fire. There could even be more, and certainly it warrants some use. The other thing I like about the pen test is automation tools are great, but human judgment is also great, and it's very hard to replicate human judgment. So I'm not saying it's an either or. For me, it's a both.
It is a both.
Yeah, and because, I mean, listen, there's no one. Security is so complicated. Like, there's no one that knows everything. I mean, to me, if a tool can find, some number of significant vulnerabilities, then I'm like, okay, that's a great tool. I don't need it to find everything. I just need it to find certain things. And same thing with human processes. If they find a certain number of things, I'm saying, great, we did not know that before. Oftentimes pen testers are doing what attackers are actually doing. So even if it's only finding a small percentage, they're potentially finding some ones that are very exploitable. By the way, I agree with you on the automation. Don't ever let me say I would have anything bad to say about automation. It's just more, I think it's an and than an or.
Yeah, so I'd agree with you on the and. We have a number of customers that are pen test firms, and it's fascinating because I didn't initially think about this and say, why would they use us?
Sure.
And it's because we cover the entire API surface, and we do it automated and completely, like, full coverage. And they came, the pen test firms come to me and they say, what you can do in an hour will take us weeks and months. But once you hand us the key to say, oh, here's the vulnerability, now we can do magic with that, right? So I agree with you, Rob, that it's an and, but it's an and that needs to be really focused with a multiplicative, not a, hey, I got this out.
I mean, to me, 90% automation, 10% human processes is much better than the other way around.
I think that's the right model. Sorry, Corey, go.
So I saw quickly you pasted in some of the high profile breaches there. I want you to talk a bit about that, but also I'm curious, I don't think we know the answer, but what percentage of breaches out there are happening in APIs that we have no idea about? Like, how do you even detect it? Unless something big like that. But I'm just curious that we might not even know these things are happening, and they're happening.
I speculate, don't have any evidence to support it, but this recent Twitter breach with with the Bitcoin and getting the famous people to send the solicitation, I'm guessing it's probably some, maybe there's some insider, but maybe it's a API breach or maybe both. But to me, it had a certain feel of some degree of automation, I guess. I don't have any data to support it at this moment, but we'll see how things play out. If you look at Twitter pretty recently, actually, and it's end of October 2019, so really not that long ago. they released a new version and said, some old versions of their APIs were, basically, I believe, not invalidating tokens or something along those lines. But that library was being used by all sorts of other apps. So, who knows, one, if that in any way is tied to it, or two, if it is an API one, but I suspect a lot of times where you don't know the answer, APIs could very well be involved. So,
you know what I tell you? Look at bot traffic, okay? Because APIs are ripe for bots.
Sure.
And so now when you start looking at how much bot traffic is on the internet, it's increasing. So Corey, way back in the day at McAfee, if you remember, we were all focused about how does somebody get control of a computer, and it was phishing and it was all that stuff, right? Well, now you've got this API, it's exposed, it's public, and you unleash a bot on it. And not just one, but hundreds of thousands of bots that are slowly, like once every day, it's hitting a command. And that's where we've now gotten to, right? Where we've consolidated data into these apps. We've exposed an API to those apps. And by the way, the technology around bots and the ability to, slowly permeate them has exploded, right?
Yeah.
So now think about that. Back to your question of how many breaches are out there. Well, I'm going to tell you us at AppSec. Our APIs are under constant attack, constant. My CTO, tells me stories every day saying, hey, we got hit with this and we got hit with that. And, it was a mushroom this and it was that. And I'm like going, I don't think we're the only ones, right? But they're
how are you detecting that? How are you detecting it as opposed to do your other companies not have the capability to see that same thing?
Yeah, well, so I think there's a couple of things, right? First of all, we're an API security company. This is what we do, right? And so from that perspective, we've instrumented and done some interesting things there. But what companies miss is that they're getting hit with hundreds of thousands of legitimate requests, right? So now you add in these hundreds of thousands of valid API calls, and you have these little bit of unknown. So let me give an example, Corey. Take the example of Facebook, right? When the Facebook breach occurred, what was it? Was this like something nefarious? Like, everybody blames Cambridge Analytica. Well, actually, it was a feature inside the Facebook API that says, show user as, right? Login user as. And what you can do as a developer is you go in and say, I want to log into Facebook as Rob Black. And it allowed anybody to do that. What is that? So Rob brought up OWASP, right? So OWASP has a top 10 list for APIs, of which 5 of the categories are business logic role issues. But they're near impossible to validate because you've got to get what the app is and the business logic. So it's kind of like it falls on a little bit of deaf ears. In Facebook's case, you're like, okay, well, did they know they had this connect as Rob? Absolutely they knew. Did they know that in the same way that Venmo, no, you could click and say, send me transact. Oh yeah, they knew. It was a feature. Did they know because of the impact that could happen over this? Absolutely not. And it's because people don't test the negative and nested negative cases to really understand the vulnerability in the API. That's the issue I see, Corey.
Yeah, I agree 1,000%. And then to not go back on my statement, but to clarify my statement of black hat, DEF CON kind of mentality, you absolutely need people thinking bad and trying to think of those horrible scenarios. I know all of us on the call and part of the audience, we're thinking of good things, but that's not reality. There are cyber criminals that want to go, and how can I get around this? And actually, it's funny. I was telling somebody the other day I kind of have that mentality too. When I was a kid, my parents used to have place wagers. How long before Corey breaks that toy? Because remember the thing you point to an animal, make a cow sound or so. It was 3 days, and I broke it open and realized it was a cassette tape. It's not really a cow in there. I was like 3. But do you have to think bad? It is that mentality, and I think that's what we are in cybersecurity. So I think we're at 45 after. I'm open to questions for the audience. So if you guys have questions or comments, but there is one there. I don't know if Rob and Faisal can see it, but let's answer it from Aaron.
Sure. It says, I think this is referring to Venmo. People are spending money so they know which merchants to launch man-in-the-middle attacks. Absolutely. So basically, if you know where money's being sent, you can absolutely know, what type of attacks to frame and where to try different types of things. So I think that's the challenge with Venmo when you're dumping tons and tons of financial transaction data, so valuable to so many attackers because just the number of different types of attacks you could craft.
Yeah, Aaron, you can speak now. Any additional questions or comments on that?
Oh no, thanks. That was well answered.
All right, cool, thanks. Ed Hoy, I see you raised your hand. Do you have a question?
Yep. Ed, you can talk now too.
You gotta unmute yourself, I think, if you're talking. Terry, can we unmute him? So?
It's not letting me. Ed has to unmute himself on his side.
Ah, okay. So while Ed does that, so I'm still curious just upon the types of attacks. It's not as many visible attacks out there, Faisal. I mean, you have, like you put, the Equifax and Capital One. It to me, it just still freaks me out that I feel like it should be so many more, considering how popular using APIs are. And even my company, I mean, we don't work with any product vendor unless they have an API, because again, we want to build those executive dashboards based upon just pulling that data. So it's how. Any other examples that you can give of attacks that you know of?
Oh yeah, so there's a huge list of them, right? I mean, the Facebook one I described, Salesforce had a very interesting one whereby
Really?
in their marketing platform, they had a capability that said, hey, show it's similar to the Facebook one where they could log in and see various tenants, i.e. of the Salesforce Marketing Cloud, be able to see various tenant data, right? So you just think about the consequence. So, but I want to go back to what you said, which is, why are these not visible? And again, I'm going to go back to my DLP days, right? And say, the problem is that, is there a reporting incentive?
Yeah.
Right. And the answer is, sometimes there is. If it's California privacy, GDPR, HIPAA, PCI, there's an imperative right there that says you have to do it. How many people are actually doing public notice? Very few. How many are, sending out private notices? A lot. Last week, I saw 3 API breach notices that, people sent out, software companies, right, that sent out that says, hey, we had this breach. It looked like this. Your data is okay, right? Or your data is not, please change your password. And I saw them because various customers brought them to us and said, hey, what does this mean? And how would you have helped? So, I think it's not out there enough because it's not public. As you start looking at the black market, you're going to see more and more data. And that's when it's going to start becoming more and more visible as to how these breaches are occurring. But I think Edward's off the mute now.
Here we go.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't figure out how to unmute this thing until a couple of seconds ago, but can you hear me now?
Yep, sure can.
Oh, okay. I do have a question, because I have a client that actually is fairly large, and on the subject of APIs, they don't develop APIs themselves. The problem is there are a lot of outside third parties with APIs that will attach to their major enterprise financial applications. And what I found out was there's very little control there, because they don't even know how many APIs they have coming in from third parties, because business managers with their credit cards could basically order a routine that will enhance what they're doing, perhaps like accounts payable or whatever. And with their credit card, they will order it and they'll get the third party to attach it to the financial application. IT isn't even aware of it. They don't have an inventory on it. Do you have any tools that actually identify the number of APIs that are coming from inbound? How do you actually determine how many APIs are on the major application?
Sure. So I think it sounds to me, Ed, like a two-part question. So one part is the vendor management piece, which I think that is going to be a huge challenge if folks are allowed to procure their own IT, just because, especially if they're working from home or they even going through the corporate network, right? So there's probably no technical control that you could put in place, or it'd be difficult to do any sort of technical controls if you're working from home, can use your credit card. So one, I think, on a vendor management side, I would put some business process controls around that. So for that piece. And then once you have a standard process for bringing in a vendor, first thing is ask them, right? I mean, so I think that's one thing, like, what are you guys doing for testing for your APIs? That's a great question. And, maybe they'll, maybe they'll say, oh, we have great processes around that, or maybe like, oh, APIs, yeah, we don't bother testing, so you can get some information there. But I think that's the first step, is understanding, getting control of your vendors and understanding. Then I'll probably turn it over to Faisal, what can be done, like, once you realize you have a problem, or you're trying to scope the understanding of that.
Yeah.
No, that's true. The first issue was from what I considered a governance standpoint.
Yep.
So policies were not in place. Basically, it says, hey, business managers, you shouldn't be able to do that without getting approval from IT. Because until you do that, they don't even know you're doing it. And they may say that could be hurtful to the major application. It hasn't been tested. So yes, from a governance standpoint, you were right. And so going forward, we did fix that. But I was just wondering, do you guys have any suggestions on looking backwards at some of the hundreds of APIs that have been put on there that have never been recorded? Any tools?
Like an inventory of APIs. I was thinking like kind of asset inventory.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
If they develop it, they have it under change management. So it gets into the inventory of an API. But if it's coming from a third party, then it didn't go through IT, but came from the business side, there's no record of it.
Yeah.
I mean,
So I mean, I think that once you've dug yourself in that deep a hole, you're going to have some serious challenges. Certainly there are a bunch of tools that you can do to automate, some testing. Now, if you're testing your vendor stuff, you typically would need to get permission for doing that. But usually you're going to be better off when you're bringing in the time to do that is when you're bringing in the vendor to do that validation. If a vendor is key, then, I think having a discussion with them and their security team and understanding what they're doing is probably the right thing to do. In many cases, vendors will give you test instances where you could test APIs and that sort of thing if you really wanted to do it. Now, the expense there would be quite large if you're talking about testing hundreds of vendors' APIs. And getting permission from all those vendors. But, I would see a path for success there. Just, it's going to be a long path with a fair number of dollars spent.
Yeah, agreed. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Ed. Let's get to Angela's question. Angela, we've unmuted you so you can actually ask it. We saw you paste it in there, but you can ask it.
Sure. You had mentioned that API security is a big issue, but it doesn't seem to be getting as heightened attention from CISOs or others. How can we make this a bigger priority? Because a lot of big organizations, and I'm just going to use health systems, they use so many software vendors, so many applications, they have their own integration teams. because everything has to be integrated. So they use a lot of APIs. Why is it not kind of top of mind when they do vendor assessments and things like that? What can we do to make it more of an urgent issue? Because it appears that it's a pretty big risk and gap.
So for our clients, when we're, I would say our clients are usually medium-sized companies, and they probably have 100 vendors, 100 vendors or more, and they're bringing in new vendors every month, every quarter. So vendor management is a huge challenge. You have to pick your spots for risk management, right? You could be totally inundated with just evaluating vendors and not get to anything else. When you do find that vendor that's really important, so let's say you are, interacting with something that let's say you're concerned about Salesforce and their APIs or something like that. I think you have to pick your spots for time and place to dig in, make sure put the burden on the vendor, especially if it's during procurement, to evaluate, and then move forward from there. And then from a societal standpoint, I do think GDPR and CCPA, just as Faisal pointed out, are going to help to maybe not specifically APIs, but basically people will treat privacy more seriously, and that will force some of these vendors to look at their APIs. But it's the reason we're having a webinar about it is because it's an unsolved problem, not because it's a solved problem.
Yeah, Angela, I'll tell you that what's happening today is that the way people are getting around the API issue is they're doing their annual pen test or their quarterly pen test, and they're stamping the ticket to say, hey, yeah, my API is secure because once a year I did this pen test. And so then the question is, and the reason for that is really obvious too, right? Because nobody buys security because they love security. They buy security because they have to buy, they need it, right? Yeah. And it's brand risk and all of these things. And so when you go back and say, okay, so that's what they're doing, what will cause them to do something different? And I think it's going to come down to a couple of things. Number one, they got to recognize the value of continuous. So Corey brought up this point of continuous security. They got to recognize it. And they recognize it because they know it doesn't work. And most CISOs are like what Corey said, which is, hey, I get a pen test. What do I do with it? Every year, it's like deja vu. I do it. I put in a file. I close the number one vulnerabilities. And more CISOs are starting to ask the question, going, is this really the best use of my time? Is this where I should spend my money? And in some cases, it is. Infrastructure, pen tests, etc. APIs are different. And so there's a movement afoot, Angela, that will make this more and more important. It's going to take a little bit of time to get there, though. And unfortunately, I think we need a breach or two that are very public to cause, unfortunately.
Exactly. And we all heard that there's never let a good breach go to waste. It sounds horrible, but that's what we got to say in cybersecurity, because you can justify getting some of these security controls in place. Looks like we're out of time. This has been a fantastic webinar. I've learned a lot, frankly. Just exposing the gaps, and I think you just said it, Faisal, that the biggest challenge is that awareness, and we're approaching it all wrong. And I want people to realize that you could, instead of doing that yearly application pen test, you could do for the same money, roughly, the pen test and the subscription remediation, and then maintain cybersecurity. Because what people want is cybersecurity to go away, because they want to deal with it, right? And so if you can say, okay, well, they're going to take care of the API security and remediation on a continuous basis, then it goes away, it's taken care of, and we can go and deal with other things. And I think that's how we have to think about it, because, hate to say, most people don't like cybersecurity because it's hard work and it's not easy and it keeps on popping up. And it doesn't actually bring money into the company. So that's how they want to approach it. And so I appreciate the partnership, frankly, with both of you, Rob and Faisal.